Welcome back to Final Fantasy. We are continuing through the Earth Cave on our way to confront the vampire who we have been told is responsible for the Earth's rot. Now, a quick question I wanted to present. Spell names. Most, if not all, Final Fantasy fans are probably aware of this, but at a certain point in the series, some of the conventional spell names changed. I'm mainly talking about the basic spells: fire, ice, lightning, or bolt, or whatever you want to call it, and cure are the main ones. And originally, they just had numbers: Fire 1, Fire 2, Fire 3. But then, once they hit Final Fantasy VIII, they were Fire, Fyra, and Fyraga, and then they continued with that trend ever since, and even in the older games when they went back and retranslated those games, a lot of those used the new spell name conventions. Now, to my understanding, that's what the spells always were in Japan, but because of limitations, they gave the spells the numbers, and then later on they just stuck with it, probably for the sake of consistency, until eventually they hit the point where they were like, you know what, let's just fix this and put the spell names how they're supposed to be. I don't know if that's actually the case. I'm not 100% certain if the spell names were always the modern ones in the Japanese versions of the games or not. That's just something I've heard. The point is, I wonder what people's preferences are. And if you want to share those thoughts, then there's something to throw in the comments, if nothing else. As for myself, when I was younger, I preferred the old spell names because it was simpler. It made more sense. I could look at Ice 2, and that name immediately told me what the spell was and how its power compared to its peers, whereas Blizzara, that didn't tell me anything. It's obtuse. It doesn't convey information to the player that tells the player what this spell is, unless they just already know what the spell is. Which, if you're playing the game, you would probably know that, of course, but it's less intuitive, and it felt like it was easier to forget. Like, when I was playing some of those games, I would sometimes forget between Fyra or Fyraga which one was supposed to be stronger, and I would have to actually look at how the spells were listed in the menu, or look at their magic point costs to remember which was supposed to be the stronger one. Nowadays, I prefer the new spell conventions though, because they feel more believable as spell names. I feel like it's kind of ridiculous, the idea of, like, Thundaga, it sounds like a magic spell, some sort of incantation or arcane word to conjure forth some sort of mystical power, as opposed to a wizard conjuring all this energy to strike down his opponent and then shouting out, Bolt 3! It sounds silly and ridiculous in application, as far as what makes sense within the world. So in that sense, from a coherent or story sense, I came to prefer the later iterations of spell names. As for how I refer to them in games, though, I just refer to them as whatever the game calls them. If I'm playing the original Final Fantasy, I'll say Fire, Fire 2, and Fire 3. Either if I'm playing it or referencing it. Like if I'm talking about Final Fantasy 1 with somebody, I'll call them by those names because those are the names that I associate with that game. Especially because I've never played a version of the original Final Fantasy past the PlayStation version in Final Fantasy Origins, which I'm pretty sure used the numbering system, from what I recall. Because I never cared for the later releases, because they kept doing weird crap that I didn't want to see in the game. But if I'm talking about, like, Final Fantasy IX, then I'll use the more modern spell names. It's all a matter of what I associate with that, what spell names I associate with that game, as far as conversation goes. But if I'm playing the game and talking about it with somebody, then I'll just probably refer to whatever I'm reading on the screen in whatever version of the game I happen to be playing. Speaking of names, there's also the matter of pronunciations, which is always a topic of debate in older games because they didn't have voiceovers, and they oftentimes use really weird names for things that don't sound like names or don't sound like real words. So then you just look at it and you're like, how the hell is that supposed to be pronounced? Two big ones from when I was younger that come up are Gao and Sabin from Final Fantasy VI. When I was younger, I pronounced Gao as Gaiju and Sabin as Saban. And that was because that's how a friend told me that they were supposed to be pronounced. And I just took his word for it. I just assumed, well, he knows better than I do, especially because I believe he got those pronunciations from a friend or relative. I forget exactly what the relationship was, but this guy was a bit older than us by a few years, so that naturally meant he's got to know better than us. He's older. And since my friend, I believe, got those pronunciations from that guy, I had no reason to doubt them. So for years, it was Gaiju and Saban. Now, as a kid, I still jokingly said Gaiju as Gao sometimes, but never seriously. I never legitimately thought that his name was pronounced Gao. I just looked at the spelling, saw that that's how it looked like it would be pronounced based on the spelling, and I would just jokingly say Gaiju because I thought Gao sounded funny. Or I would jokingly say Gao because I thought Gao sounded funny, but I still thought the name was pronounced Gaiju. As I got older, though, I kind of put a bit more thought into the story and the character in particular, and it just occurred to me that Gao just made more sense for the pronunciation of his name because it's probably not his birth name. Heck, given his backstory, he might not even have a birth name. And I got to thinking that Gao it sounds like a sound a monster might make or some sort of onomatopoeia. And in that sense, that's probably why it's his name. It might just be the very first word he ever said himself, or the closest to a word he ever said. And so that it became inherited as his name, or some sort of origin like that. It's probably supposed to sound like some sort of... It's probably supposed to sound more like a sound than a name, which makes the simplicity and the strangeness of Gao fit better because it sounds like some sort of feline monster might. It sounds like some sort of feline monster might make. Like instead of a meow, it's like gow. Even past that, though, I still said Sabin as Saban for a long time, because I had no real reason to question that one. It just, to me, sounded like a made-up name or maybe some sort of foreign name that had a weird pronunciation that I didn't understand because it might have been from some other language or country or something with different linguistic rules. But then in high school, I met somebody who insisted that the name was pronounced Sabin, and I actually tried to correct him. He pronounced it Sabin, and I actually tried to correct him by telling him that it was supposed to be pronounced Saban. But then he countered that by telling me, no, it's pronounced Sabin, and I know that because I actually knew somebody in elementary school named Sabin. And I just kind of was like, well, that kind of shoots my whole argument out the window because I had no foundation or logic for it. I just assumed it was Saban because that's what I was told. And any reasons for that, I just kind of made up in my own head to justify it. But then this friend comes along and is like, I actually knew somebody by that name. I think I know how it's pronounced. And so ever since then, I went by Sabin as well. Riding on the topic of that person I just mentioned, that friend or relative of my friend or whatever the relationship was, I don't even remember the guy's name, let alone his relationship to my friend. I think it might have been Justin. Justin is the name that comes to mind, but I could be completely wrong or mistaking him for somebody else who I might have known through similar means at around that same point in time, who happened to be Justin, but was somebody completely different. But less related to Final Fantasy and more related to that particular individual, I remember one time when it was my friend's birthday party, and we went to a nearby park, and this guy was one of the people invited to this party. And I remember we went to a park to throw water balloons at each other, which was a reasonable birthday activity because my friend's birthday was in August, so naturally it was super hot. So we decided to go to the nearby park and have a water balloon fight. And I only remember that because there was this one instance where that very guy got me on the ground. I was on the ground, he's standing over me. He might have even been pinning me to the ground with his foot or his knee or something, I don't remember. But he's just right on top of me with a water balloon, and he hucks it right at my face. Hits my face, doesn't pop. And both of us, I wasn't even relieved. Both of us were just like, what the hell, why didn't it pop? And you'd think I would be relieved because when he's standing above me, he was like, no, don't do it! Kind of like freaking out because he's about to get me just dead on with this thing. But then after that, we were both confused and we were just like, what the hell? And then he picks up the water balloon, throws it into my face again. It doesn't pop. And at this point, we're both laughing like, what the hell is wrong with this water balloon? And I think he did it like 3 or 4 more times. And it just wouldn't pop. I think it did eventually, or we just gave up on it, but it was just this funny instance where it was at the point where I didn't even care anymore. And I don't like getting my face wet, especially when I was younger. There's just something about getting my face wet that bothered me. Maybe something happened when I was younger to give me an aversion to getting my face wet. I have no idea. But it's just something that bothered me a lot, even to the point where when I would be in the shower, I couldn't stand washing my face. I'd like wash my hair, everything else, but I would not wash my face because I would just like seize up if I got my face wet. It didn't bother me in the rain or stuff like that. That didn't bother me. It was more just like if it was anything else, like the rain, it didn't bother me, probably because I was so used to that. And eventually with showering, it stopped bothering me as well. But like, it was like a water balloon fight or spraying each other with water guns or like swimming even, I just couldn't stand getting my face wet. But despite the fact that he was throwing this balloon right into my face, which I think is why I was freaking out when I was under him before he threw it the first time, because obviously in that position you're gonna peg the person right in the face. I would have done the same thing. And so, but then after the balloon just wasn't working, I completely forgot about that because we were both just like, what the hell is wrong with this stupid balloon? Why isn't it popping? And I don't think we had any other similar problems with any of the other water balloons the entire day. It was just that one in that instance where it just wasn't cooperating in the most ridiculous and hilarious way. Okay, so let's see. Hang on a second. Alright, so let's see. Looking through my list, I still have some stories to share. Going back to that friend I mentioned and sticking to the Final Fantasy VI topic, Final Fantasy 4, 5, and 6, at least the original Super Nintendo versions, all had multiplayer. You could play all of those games with 2 players. And I always liked the idea of that. I've always wanted to sit down and play one of those games all the way through, start to finish, with another person. And I think I've only ever done that once, which was a few years ago, where I played through Final Fantasy V with a friend. And we did it 2-player. But other than that, I don't think I've ever completed a run doing that. I've started runs with people before, but we would always stop at a certain point. We would never get all the way through to the end of the game for one reason or another. But there's this one time, I think it was the very first time I wanted to try multiplayer, and it was with the friend who introduced me to RPGs by introducing me to Final Fantasy VI, which is the same friend I've already referenced in this discussion. And I sucked at RPGs when I was younger, and he knew that. He knew that especially because whenever I would get to a boss, I don't remember if it was as prominent in Final Fantasy VI or other Final Fantasy games, but I do distinctly remember it being an issue in Chrono Trigger, where whenever I would get to a boss, I would hand him the controller because I didn't feel confident beating the bosses. So, and that's actually another story. I don't know if I've ever talked about that before. I feel like I have. But the short of that is the very first boss in Chrono Trigger I actually fought on my own was Masamune. And that was a terrible first boss to attempt on my own. I beat him eventually, but just the fact that I didn't fight any of the earlier bosses that were so much easier. And then when I finally put my foot down and I'm like, I want to actually be doing this on my own, and told my friend that, I think he actually like went to grab the controller from me like I was going to offer it to him as I was approaching that boss. But then I was like, you know what? I want to start beating the bosses on my own from now on. And it just had to be with arguably one of the tougher bosses in the game, or at least one of the toughest early bosses. But anyway, because of knowing that I sucked at RPGs, my friend wasn't confident in us playing the game together. He basically, he didn't present it in any sort of a rude manner. It was a respectful, like, you're not good at this game sort of suggestion, or whatever you want to call it. And he wasn't confident in us playing together because he felt that I would just be so much worse than him at the game that I would be holding us back if we were to try to do something like that. So, I remember this one time when I wanted to prove to him that I could keep up, that I wouldn't be a detriment, that I could play well enough for us to play together. And so I remember this one time when I was trying to show that to him, and I was playing super fast, and I thought that's all that would matter. Like, I was just clicking through the menus as faster than I ever have before, and probably I ever have since, just to try to prove that I can play quickly enough to keep up with him, as if speed alone was the only factor. Not to mention that it was right at the beginning of the game, so literally it was just things like click tools, click auto crossbow, click magic with Terra, use fire. So it was also at the point in the game when the menus were at their simplest, so I wouldn't have to be navigating through all this complex stuff and really needed to be able to utilize any form of legitimate strategy. But in my head, the only issue was being able to be fast enough to keep up with the game and not dilly-dally in the menus while the enemies are beating the crap out of us, because we both played on active. Ultimately, he and I never played through the game together anyway. I don't think we really even attempted it. I just remember that moment of me trying super hard to impress him, to be like, see, I'm good enough for us to do this. I'm looking at the game right now, and it's really weird seeing a black mage not in the bottom position. But that's because even though the black belt has so many more hit points, I'm at a point in the game where the black belt's defense is severely struggling. So, even to the point where the black mage has higher defense. So, I put the black mage above, because yes, he has way lower hit points, but each hit he does take would be taking less damage. Audacity froze up there for a second, so I'm going to repeat that just in case it didn't get through. But basically, in case it got cut off, what I was saying is that I have the black mage up front because at this point, he just has such higher defense that even though his hit points are way lower, he can get more out of those hit points, theoretically speaking, by taking less damage per hit. And I feel like at a certain point, higher defense will carry you further than higher hit points. Because if you have like 70 more hit points than the other guy, then that's great. But that doesn't really matter if you're taking like 15 more damage per turn, especially because your maximum hit points are only a factor until you're so injured that your hit points are down to the same as everybody else anyway. And especially at this point when healing options are kind of limited, how often are you going to be at max hit points versus just keeping everybody outside of kill range? So having higher maximum hit points only gets you so far in regards to your survivability over other characters. See, like, even just in this fight alone, the black mage only took 1 damage from these enemies that are hitting the black belt for about 4 to 8 damage. And yeah, there's variables there that can affect the damage, but I just feel like at this point, having higher defense will go a longer way than having higher hit points. Because the higher hit points stop mattering once everybody is injured to having about the same amount of hit points. And once you're at that point, then defense is all that matters. Either way, I don't think it matters anyway, because I believe the 3rd and 4th slots have the same probability of being targeted. The top spot has the highest probability, and the 2nd spot has the 2nd highest. And in the instruction manual, it just says that the higher on your formation a character is, the more likely they are to be attacked. But I believe, mechanically speaking, the statistics of the 3rd and 4th slot being targeted are the same. I believe. I'm pretty sure I've read other people state that before. But you can go ahead and fact check me on that if you want. But either way, I still feel more comfortable having the 3rd and 4th slot in the order that I think is more advantageous. Just if for no other reason as a placebo effect, because of how the rest of the formation is affected by that statistical mechanic, or whatever you want to call it. Let's see. Blah, blah, blah. Blah, blah, blah. Let's just stick with Final Fantasy VI for the moment. I guess. Yeah. Because I feel like I have the most stories about Final Fantasy VI anyway. I don't think Final Fantasy VI is the Final Fantasy game I've played the most throughout my life, though. My most played Final Fantasy is probably 4. I've definitely beaten that one the most times, but it's also shorter than all the rest. I would say it's even shorter than Final Fantasy 1. A lot more happens during it, but so many of the dungeons you can blow through so quickly, and especially if you're not reading the dialogue because you already know what's going on and already know what's happening, then you can blow through that game really quickly. I would say their lengths are at least comparable to each other, regardless of which one is actually longer. Just because Final Fantasy IV has a lot more that happens, but Final Fantasy I has slower battles that take longer to get through most of the time, and just the dungeons themselves are much larger, save for maybe some of the later Final Fantasy IV dungeons. So less happens, but it still takes a comparable amount of time to get through because of the game's pacing, which is regardless of the game's actual content. But anyway, character names. Who likes to rename their characters in RPGs? When I was younger, I liked doing it. I don't know, I liked giving characters names. I think it might have partly just been because it's a mechanic that exists in the game, so I felt like I was supposed to do it. But sometimes I also liked trying to name some of the characters after people I know, or naming them after characters in other games, just for the fun of it. But there's one time where actually there are 2 times listed in here where that bit me in the ass. the first time, actually, I was gonna say the first time was in Final Fantasy VI, but they're both in Final Fantasy VI. Eventually, getting back on the naming topic in general real quick though, eventually I stopped. Actually, that's sort of on topic, because eventually I stopped naming characters in RPGs because I felt like, not so much because I didn't like the feature, but I just felt like it created unnecessary confusion, especially if you're trying to talk with somebody about a game. Like, I remember I would sometimes be talking with other kids at school about Final Fantasy VI, and I would want to reference a character, but I would struggle to remember that character's name because in my head, I would be remembering the name that I gave the character or regularly gave the character as opposed to the character's canonical name. But if I was talking about Edgar and referred to him as John or whatever I might have regularly named him, nobody's gonna know what I'm talking about. So to me it felt like, what good is naming characters in RPGs if all it's going to wind up doing is causing me to confuse myself when trying to talk about the game with other people? Or anything of that sort, where I need to know the character's name, because in that case, not only does it create added confusion because I'm having to try to remember the character's name, in addition to the name I gave them myself, but also it stopped making sense to me after a while. And that's also kind of why I don't like nicknaming Pokemon, but that has less to do with discussions with other people, and more that I don't want to confuse myself. Especially if it's a new Pokemon game where I'm trying to learn all the new Pokemon names. I want to see their name, their canonical species name, to better memorize and learn what that name is, whereas if I give them a nickname, it's just gonna create added confusion for myself. Anyway, one of the very first times where that really sunk in, that giving characters in RPGs your own names just isn't worth all of that extra confusion, was in Final Fantasy VI with the character Locke. Going into sometimes trying to name characters based on people I know, for whatever reason, I liked giving Locke my own name, which is Daryl. I don't know why I chose Locke for that, especially because he wasn't really even close to my favorite character. I think it might have been because I saw him as sort of the not main character. Final Fantasy VI is a weird game when it comes to main characters because there's no real centralized main character. Whoever the main character is kind of jumps around based on particular points in the story, to the point where it never really feels like there's a concrete main character. But when I was a kid, I always felt like if there had to be a main character, it would be Terra and Locke. Not only because I felt like they were the most central of the characters, but also because this thought came later, naturally, but during the final battle with Kefka at the very end of the game, when you're fighting the final boss, there's the dialogue leading up to it, and there's that part where Kefka rises up on a massive spire of stone, and he says this stuff, and then you have this moment where Terra also rises up and says some stuff, and Locke rises up and says some stuff, and that particular moment in my mind cemented Terra and Locke as the main characters, because you have this pivotal, well, not pivotal, but this climactic moment where it's the climax, it's the final moment in the game, and to choose Locke and Terra specifically for that moment, giving them sort of a center stage moment away from all the other characters, because all the other characters are there, but they're just kind of hanging out, and then you give this spotlight to Terra and Locke, that to me as a kid cemented those two in my mind as the main characters. But even before that, I always saw those two as kind of like the main characters. I understood that the game didn't really have a main character, but I always felt like Terra and Locke were more main character than most of the rest of the cast, like Edgar or Cyan or Shadow or whatever. Anyway, so I used to name Locke Daryl, and then I got to the world of Ruin, and I came across Daryl's tomb, spelled exactly the same way. So naturally, I assumed this was Locke's tomb. That made no sense with the story leading into it, but as I've said in past videos, I didn't pay close attention to story in RPGs. I only read the story to know where I was supposed to go next. So I didn't piece that together. So I thought it was supposed to be Locke's tomb. And then one day I brought that up to somebody. Also because I never beat it at that time. I don't remember why, but on that playthrough, that was the furthest in the game I had ever gotten, and I never got past it. I think I went up to Daryl's tomb, but I didn't complete it. I don't even think I entered it. I just got to that point, and then for one reason or another, I never got any further on that particular run. So for a long time, I thought, oh, it's Locke's tomb. And then I was talking about it with a friend, and I was talking about the furthest and I told him that was the furthest I ever got. But in compensation, in acknowledgement of the fact that the name was because of what I had named the character, I referred to it as Locke's tomb. And he didn't know what the hell I was talking about. And then there was like this bit of confusion between us until it occurred to him that I was talking about Daryl's tomb, and he corrected me that it was Daryl's tomb. And I'm just like, and I was just completely flabbergasted by the fact that that was the case, because for a long time I had assumed it was supposed to be Locke's tomb because of what I had named Locke. And that's, at that moment I was hit with kind of an epiphany of sorts of how terrible of an idea it is to rename characters in RPGs that have established canonical names tied to them. And that's kind of where it sunk in. And I realized that I need to just, if a game gives characters default names, I need to just use the default name. So that, to avoid that confusion again. To the point where, if a game didn't necessarily have a default name, but I assumed there was a default name, I would use that. Going back to Pokemon, in the old Pokemon games, I would always name my character Ash, because I assumed that was supposed to be his default name. Because of the anime. And from my perspective, the anime came first. So because of that, I always would name my character in Red and Blue Ash, because in my head, that was his default name. The game just didn't give it as an option for some weird reason, because it was wrong. Just like how I thought the gym order listed in the game was wrong, because they put Koga before Sabrina, and I believe in the gym badge order listed in the status menu, even though that was the incorrect order, because that's not the order as it happened in the anime. Another problem that can happen with renaming characters that happened to me is, forgetting that you named somebody something and then naming somebody else that exact same thing. This also happened in Final Fantasy VI. I was playing the game, and for whatever reason, I decided to give Setzer the name Astral. I don't know why. It would have obvious for me, it would have been named after the character from Shining Force 2 named Astral. I think I just assumed Setzer was an old man because he has gray hair. So I decided to name him Astral. And then I advanced with the game a little bit. I forgot that I named Setzer Astral, and when I got to Strago, I named him Astral because he's an old wizard man. Then I returned to having everybody in the party and noticed that I had named Setzer Astral. So throughout the rest of the game, I had 2 characters with the exact same name in my party. And I believe I deliberately used them together at certain points in the game just to emphasize how dumb of a mistake that was. But that's just another example throughout my life that sort of exemplified why I eventually came to the conclusion that renaming characters in RPGs is just a bad idea. Alright, give me a moment to cross off a few things so I can look through this list a little bit easier.